When the temperature drops to minus 50 degrees Celsius on the open steppe and stays there for 5 months, you don't survive by accident. You survive because every piece of your life, what you eat, what you burn, where you sleep, how you think, has been worked out over centuries into one system where a single failure means you freeze to death in your own shelter. Most people today panic when the heating bill spikes or the power cuts out during a snowstorm. The Mongols built an empire in conditions that would kill an unprepared modern human in under 4 hours. This is how they did it. The physics of round shelters that turned felt into a thermal battery. The fuel economy that ran on dried horse dung. The freeze-dried meat strips that weighed nothing and lasted forever. The livestock positioned as living windbreaks, and the psychological discipline that kept families sane through 150 days of darkness. This was a complete survival machine where the yurt, the herd, the fire, and the food all functioned together to extract life from a landscape that offered none.
At minus 50 degrees, survival is a masterpiece of engineering. Welcome to the human craft. Today, we review how the Mongols cooked, ate, and mastered the world's most brutal winter.
The yurt wasn't a tent. It was a portable heat engine that happened to look like one. Every structural decision, the circular walls, the compression ring at the crown, the direction the door faced, existed because the alternative meant freezing to death in your sleep. Start with the shape. Circular walls eliminated cold-trapping corners. Square structures create pockets where air stagnates, frost builds up, and heat disappears. The yurt's round lattice wall forced constant circulation around the central hearth, turning the interior into a convection system where warm air spiraled upward in a continuous loop. No corners meant no dead zones. No dead zones meant no frost creeping across the walls while you slept 3 feet away. The felt walls were breathable thermal regulators. Families layered 3 to 5 sheets of thick wool felt depending on season, creating dead air pockets between each layer. The same principle as modern insulated jackets, except you lived inside it. But the part that kept them alive, the felt allowed moisture to escape. Cooking, breathing, body heat, all of it produced water vapor. In an airtight shelter, that vapor condenses on the coldest surface available, which at minus 50 degrees Celsius is every interior wall. It freezes into sheets of ice. You end up sleeping inside a tomb lined with frost that sucks heat out of the air faster than your fire can replace it. Felt breathed. Vapor passed through the fibers and escaped before it could freeze. The yurt stayed dry, and dry meant survivable. The door always faced south. Not for symbolism or tradition, because the Siberian high-pressure system shoved Arctic air straight down from the north, and a north-facing entrance invited wind to strip every calorie of heat out of the yurt the second someone stepped outside. Southern exposure gave you the best shot at avoiding direct blasts. A thick felt flap hung over the entrance, creating a basic airlock. Outer flap closed. Person entered, outer flap dropped, inner space sealed. No heat plume got sucked out by pressure differentials. The hearth sat dead center because positioned there, it radiated heat equally in all directions. No one side of the yurt stayed cold while the other roasted, but it did more than heat. Rising smoke and hot air spiraled up to the crown opening, the tonneau, which worked as both chimney and pressure regulator. The upward draft pulled fresh air in from below, expelled carbon monoxide, and kept the interior breathable without flooding the space with freezing wind. Families slept in a radial pattern around the fire, feet toward the flame, heads toward the felt walls. It was a thermal gradient. Core body temperature stayed highest, while extremities stayed warm enough to avoid frostbite. Everyone became part of the heating system. The wooden lattice frame, kana, flexed under wind pressure instead of snapping. At -50 degrees Celsius, wood contracts. Rigid structures crack. The yurt's lattice bent, absorbed stress, and held because the compression ring at the crown, the tuno, distributed tension like a wheel hub holding spokes. The whole structure moved with the wind, which is why it survived storms that destroyed anything solid. This wasn't architecture. It was clothing at the scale of a family. The yurt worked the same way a deal worked. Layered, flexible, breathable. Both trapped air, allowed moisture to escape, and bent instead of breaking when the environment tried to kill you. The Mongolian steppe has no trees, not few trees or sparse forests. Virtually none, except in narrow river valleys where water creates microclimates that don't represent the other 99% of the landscape. So when winter locked down for 5 months, and you needed fire every single day to boil water, cook meat, and prevent your family from freezing to death in their sleep, wood wasn't an option. Wood was what you saved for tool handles and structural repairs. Your firewood was argal, dried animal dung, and it was the only reason the yurt stayed warm enough to sustain human life. Argal came from horses, cattle, sheep, and yaks. It was infinite as long as the herds stayed healthy, which made it the foundation of the entire thermal economy. Families collected it year-round, but summer and autumn were harvest season. Women and children walked the grazing routes, gathering dried paddies and stacking them near camp or in sheltered piles where wind wouldn't scatter them. A single family could burn through hundreds of kilograms in a winter. You didn't stockpile it for aesthetics. You stockpiled it because running out meant death. Horse dung burned best. High fiber content from constant grass consumption meant it held together as it dried and produced steady heat when lit. Well-dried argal could reach temperatures hot enough for boiling water and slow-cooking meat. Not explosive heat, but reliable heat, which mattered more when your fuel source had to last months. Cattle and yak dung worked nearly as well. Sheep dung was smaller, burned faster, required more frequent feeding of the fire, but it added up when you had a flock of 50 animals producing it daily. The smell wasn't what you'd expect. Fully dried argal produced surprisingly little offensive odor when burned. Earthy, grassy, slightly acrid, but not fecal. The key was dryness. Wet or semi-dry dung smoked heavily and filled the yurt with choking fumes that made eyes water and lungs burn. Dry dung burned clean enough that the scent became associated with warmth, food, and safety. To a Mongol child, the smell of burning argal was the smell of home. Winter collection was dangerous, but necessary. You couldn't stockpile 5 months of fuel in autumn. It took too much space and too much labor. So families kept gathering during brief warming periods when temperatures climbed to merely -20 degrees Celsius, and the wind died down enough to make exposure survivable. Frozen dung had to be brought inside and thawed near the fire before it would burn efficiently. Wet dung wasted heat trying to evaporate moisture instead of producing flame. Fire management was a skill practiced daily. Keeping a fire alive overnight required banking coals under a layer of ash, which insulated them and slowed combustion without extinguishing it completely. In the morning, you cleared the ash, added small amounts of argal, and let the embers reignite the fuel. Letting the fire die completely was avoided whenever possible. Relighting from scratch in -50 degrees Celsius, especially with wind, could take dangerous amounts of time and energy. Embers were tended like a living thing because in a real sense, they were the thing keeping you alive. Argal was stored sunlight. Grass grew from solar energy absorbed during the summer. Animals ate the grass and concentrated that energy in their bodies. Dung was the byproduct. a portable battery of calories that could be converted back into heat when the steppe turned into a frozen wasteland and the sun barely cleared the horizon. The Mongols were burning the biological output of their herds and turning it into the heat that made human habitation possible. Without argal, the yurt was just a pile of felt and wood sitting on frozen ground. With it, the yurt became a furnace. Mongol winter food had one job: keep you alive when nothing grew, nothing moved. And burning enough calories to stay warm meant your body was a furnace that needed constant fuel. There was no variety, no freshness, no concern for what tasted good. Every food had to justify its existence by offering maximum caloric density, preservation stability, or micronutrients that kept your teeth from falling out. This was the minimum viable cuisine, sharpened by centuries of trial and fatal error. Borts was meat turned into stone. Lean mutton or beef was cut into thin strips in autumn and hung outside to freeze dry in the cold, arid wind. Within weeks, it became rock-hard, lightweight, and nearly imperishable. A saddlebag of borts could sustain a rider for weeks because it was almost pure protein, condensed and preserved without fire or salt. To eat it, you shaved pieces into boiling water or milk, where it rehydrated into a protein-rich soup base. Borts required almost no fuel to cook, just enough to heat liquid, making it argal efficient. It wasn't delicious. It was functional, and it worked. Airag was fermented mare's milk, made in summer and autumn, but essential to winter survival. Fermentation produced vitamin C, B vitamins, and probiotics, exactly what you needed to prevent scurvy when no vegetables existed, and your diet was meat, milk, and more meat. The mild alcohol content, around 2 to 3%, provided a small caloric boost and psychological warmth that mattered when you were spending 18 hours a day inside a yurt staring at felt walls. Airag was stored in leather sacks and stayed semi-liquid even in extreme cold because the alcohol and fermentation byproducts lowered its freezing point. Families brought frozen chunks inside to thaw by the fire, then drank it throughout the day. Fat was medicine. Mutton tail fat, bone marrow, clarified butter called chartreuse provided the caloric density needed to fuel bodies burning 4,000 to 6,000 calories a day, just maintaining core temperature. A modern diet tries to limit fat. A Mongol winter diet demanded it. Organ meats, liver, heart, kidneys, were prized not for taste but for micronutrients that muscle meat lacked. The Mongols ate nose to tail because wasting any part of a slaughtered animal was wasting energy, and energy was the only currency that mattered. Milk tea, sute tsai, was liquid survival. Boiled milk, water, tea, salt, sometimes butter or fat stirred in. It was sipped constantly from dawn until sleep. This was tea as fuel, not beverage. Warm, fatty, salty liquid food that kept core temperature stable and provided hydration without the shock of drinking plain water, which had to be melted from snow at the cost of precious fuel. Every sip was calories. Every sip was warmth. Blood sausage embodied the nothing wasted principle. When an animal was slaughtered, usually in early winter, timed so the cold itself became refrigeration. Blood was mixed with fat, grain if available, and organ meat, then stuffed into cleaned intestines and boiled. These sausages froze solid within hours and could be thawed and eaten throughout winter. Slaughter timing was critical. Too early and a warm spell might spoil the meat before it froze. Too late and the animal weakened, losing body mass you needed to harvest. This diet had no filler, no garnish, no food eaten for pleasure. Everything served a purpose. Borts was portable protein. Airag was vitamin insurance. Fat was concentrated fuel. Milk tea was warmth you could drink. Blood sausage was waste turned into calories. The Mongol winter menu was an equation solved over generations. What's the minimum input required to produce maximum survival output when the landscape offers nothing and mistakes are fatal? The animals weren't livestock the way we usually think of them. Fenced in, fed on schedule, kept at arm's length from daily life. They were living infrastructure. The herd was a mobile heat source, a weather prediction tool, a backup food supply, and the entire reason the yurt worked as shelter instead of being just a pile of felt-around people waiting to freeze. The relationship wasn't about humans taming animals. It was a metabolic partnership where survival moved in both directions. Horses were the keystone. Mongol horses could dig through snow up to 70 centimeters deep with their hooves, punching craters down to dormant grass underneath. That meant they fed themselves even in blizzards, unlike cattle or camels that starved when pasture vanished under snow. They were short, shaggy, and built like fat reserves with legs. Thick subcutaneous fat insulated them and provided slow-burn fuel through lean stretches when grazing was impossible. That fat wasn't just for the horse. It was for you. A horse that survived winter on its own body stores was a horse you didn't have to feed from your dwindling supplies. Horses were positioned upwind of the yurt when possible. Their bodies made a living windbreak. A herd of 20 horses clustered together generated a microclimate measurably warmer than the air around them. Respiration, body heat, sheer mass blocked wind and pushed warmth outward. Families didn't keep horses close for convenience. They kept them close because the thermal benefit was real. Sheep were portable blankets and breakfast. They were brought near camp at night, often penned in makeshift enclosures of stacked stone or felt scraps by the yurt. 50 sheep packed together radiate serious heat. You could feel the temperature difference standing next to the pen versus 10 meters away. Their wool became felt for yurt walls. Their milk, frozen into blocks during the day, was thawed by the fire at night and eaten as is or churned into butter. Their fat was rendered into cooking grease and candle material. Lambing was timed for early spring, late enough that newborns didn't freeze immediately, early enough that they had months to grow before the next winter hit. Yaks replaced cattle at higher altitudes and in harsher zones. Yaks are built for cold, multi-layered coats, low surface area to volume ratio, slow metabolism that conserves energy. They're close to immune to hypothermia. Yak milk is 6 to 7% fat, compared to 3 to 4% for cows, which made it perfect for butter and cheese that stored energy in dense, stable forms. A single yak produced enough high-fat milk to sustain a family through weeks when other food ran low. Animals were early warning systems. Experienced herders read behavior like instrument panels. Horses turning their rumps into the wind signaled an incoming storm. They positioned themselves instinctively to protect vulnerable faces and lungs. Sheep refusing to graze meant atmospheric pressure dropping before a blizzard you couldn't see yet. Livestock didn't just provide food and warmth. They provided information that determined whether you stayed in camp or got caught in whiteout conditions 5 kilometers from shelter. Livestock health was human health. A sick herd meant no milk, no dung for fuel, no emergency meat. Veterinary knowledge, recognizing pneumonia in sheep, preventing frostbite on exposed udders, treating wounds before infection set in, was survival knowledge. You didn't keep animals healthy because you loved them. You kept them healthy because their bodies were the machinery that powered your existence. The winter camp worked as a thermal collective. Humans built the yurt and tended the fire. The fire burned argal. Argal came from animals. Animals grazed the steppe and converted grass into body heat, milk, and dung. Humans managed the animals and positioned them to block wind. The yurt sheltered humans. Humans fed the fire. The fire kept humans alive long enough to manage animals. It was a closed-loop system where every member's survival depended on the others, and removing any single piece caused total collapse. The herd wasn't something the Mongols owned. It was something they were part of.